Welcome to the ISTEP Network podcast. We provide real-world insight into complicated sustainability topics.
Hear from frontline practitioners and experts.
Hi everyone, welcome to ISTEP's podcast, which is the July edition. I'm Jyoshitha, Sustainability Analyst at Fosterra and a Research Analyst for ISTEP, and I will be your host for the next 30 minutes. We are joined by Benjamin Foster, CEO and founder of Fosterra and ISTEP. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jyoshitha, and welcome everyone. My name is Ben Foster, and I've been leading sustainability efforts for nearly 20 years now, and really enjoy learning and sharing ideas across companies, across countries, and others to really help move forward towards a more sustainable future. I'm looking forward to talking about this recent conference and what we learned and how it can be applied to others around the globe.
Yeah, we're very, very excited for this month's topic. Last month, Ben and I were in London to attend the Responsible Supply Chain Conference, one of the official events of the London Climate Action Week that happened in June. The overall event brought together nearly 100,000 people to London, and our conference included sustainability professionals from across industries to explore strategies, real-world solutions, and the kind of, cross-sector insights that help us move toward building a more responsible supply chain. And one of the first phrases we heard in the conference was that spreadsheets aren't going to cut it anymore. We heard this from the NHS supply chain team, and that really highlighted the data problem everyone in sustainability faces. And it's a pattern that we have also noticed across multiple sectors, and that is what we're going to be unpacking in today's episode. Ben, are you ready to share what we heard and what it means for sustainability professionals among supply chains?
I am ready if you are. Looking forward to it.
Yes, I am ready too. But yeah, before we get into any specifics, what would you say was your overall takeaway from the conference?
Yeah, looking across the RSCC, the Responsible Supply Chain, and London Climate Action Week, I think overall the participants really had a strong alignment on the challenges and the things that we could do really to continue making progress, even in these uncertain times. One universal underlying context during this record hot weather in London that we had that week was that we must take action. There was no more debate on the why we must tackle these major issues, but rather how do we learn and move forward together. It was very inspiring, and it also really strengthened our resolution that we must do things differently to change our path, and we must do it now.
Yeah. Especially having a London Climate Action Week conference or the event in the middle of heat wave put things into a lot of perspective on there's no question of why anymore, it's just how. But yeah, let's start with the line that we introduced the podcast with. The NHS supply chain team were there at the event, and they spoke about how they are trying to make their supply chains more sustainable. And one interesting thing that they noted was that spreadsheets aren't going to cut it anymore. And I'd ask you the question, why do you think so?
Yeah, I think the NHS, because they have such a mission critical supply chain, right? It's all about providing healthcare on a national level. And so when they are looking at sustainability, they realize that there's a lot more involved than just gathering data. And so I think there are two issues here to unpack, and we'll discuss these a little bit more as we share other stories from the event. One is that the volume and the complexity of data that's available or that people want to get and gather is huge. And so that means that a spreadsheet is challenged to do that effectively. And the second is the relationships matter. These are people that are making decisions and that have access to the sort of information that we need and can work on solutions together. And so the personal aspect makes a difference, and you can't really do that through a spreadsheet. And in fact, all these issues were covered in some way by nearly every speaker that was part of the event, and in ways that were relevant to their specific organizations. But they all talked to these two topics, I think, in different ways.
Yeah, I agree. But have you heard something similar come from, your circles, your contacts, or the clients that we have recently?
There's definitely a strong trend toward companies moving beyond simply demanding data or setting emissions targets for suppliers. They want more detailed insight so that they can prioritize. And it's also about collaborating on key challenges that they face. They're looking for solutions that are scalable and robust. That means they need to really have a way to get that data and get it effectively in a standardized way, and to use tools that they have available to them or that they might want to create. And then using insights into the organization and what's happening in the drivers that help them move beyond just the simple spreadsheets or formulaic surveys. So we think that this is definitely something that is really common and resonated well across our area, which is partly why I was excited to speak at that event as well. Joe, so based on that, I mean, this was your first major event like this. I'm curious,
Yeah.
what you think about the experience and your observations, and maybe why others who couldn't make it this year might be interested in attending an event like it in the future.
I think I think there were two main highlights for me across the event. One was definitely something we have spoken about a lot of times, especially even on ISTEP podcast, is that sustainability professionals usually work, you know, alone as a one-man team or as a very, very small team, which means that, there's not a lot of times where you can discuss ideas with, discuss how you're going to approach your problems with, because other teams don't really know what you're dealing with and like how complex it is what you're dealing with. And I think when I interacted with people who were present there, it was really refreshing to just bounce around ideas and also just realize that how, even though people from so many different industries were present, the problems that we are facing are kind of similar, and how we can take inspiration from one another to implement it. So yeah, I think those were really just really, really refreshing. And I think from the conference itself is a key takeaway. I think one thing that you also mentioned earlier, which we'll be also speaking about later in the podcast, was about, how humans are, like, people are behind supply chains. So just focusing on data or just focusing on gathering data and streamlining that process is not enough, but you have to focus on the people who are behind the supply chain if you want to drive down change. So yeah, that was really, really insightful.
Yeah, thanks, Josha. That's super interesting and great to get that perspective. I like to talk about fresh eyes and you have that good perspective on what's happening and seeing that. And that's where in a conference like whether it's the Climate Action Week or our RSCC event within it, all that time in between the meetings to really
Mm,
share. It's not just a 30-minute webinar or a 30-minute call or something remotely. In between, where you're having some coffee or you're having some tea and you're describing like what's happening outside of that arena of a specific topic. That's where a lot of the things happen and the bonds happen that really move things forward. So yeah, that's a great observation. Thanks.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Speaking of that, how we spoke to different companies, was there any company's approach you found the most interesting?
I think they were all interesting. I'm going to pick one or two of them just for example, but
Mhm.
they all had their own unique challenges. A lot of different industries were represented. Leprino Foods, major global manufacturer, similar to some of the companies that we would work with. They have a real programmatic approach to working with suppliers because it's a long lead time for them to make change for agricultural. They make dairy products, cheese, and dairy products. And there's a long lead time on agricultural best practices that can be implemented and herds and manufacturing processes. So they're looking at a long-term engagement effort, and they have a really neat way to think about that and an acronym they use to make sure that they're checking all the boxes to really think about things differently. And their suppliers ultimately have a huge impact not only on the footprint, right? Most companies have a footprint that a carbon footprint that's 85% or more made up by suppliers, but then also on product quality, right? You want good quality milk going into it to make the good quality cheese. But that's the same on any product, really. If you're manufacturing a consumer good, that input, everything has to be made to a certain tolerance, to a certain standard. And so I think those lessons are widely applicable.
Yeah, I agree. I think one another company, I mean, a lot of companies had a very similar, approach on like prioritizing their suppliers and, driving down change. But another company that I think was well aligned with Leprino's approach was B&Q. They
Mhm.
are big retailers and they focused on how they have responsibility to put down sustainable products out there so that it's a default choice for their customers to buy. Because as a consumer, you might not be thinking about, oh, it's sustainable, but if a product is sustainable, it's affordable, if it's good quality, it would be your default pick on how they're trying to achieve them, which I found really interesting. So I think my next question, combining the efforts of, approaches of B&Q and Leprino would be, do you think collaborating with suppliers, how these companies did, would inspire a shift in mindset?
I think there's really no viable path forward without engaging with suppliers. They have to be part of the solution. And they do often have a lot of ideas in their pipeline that they can share. Now, it has to also align with customers and the go-to-market strategy for sustainable products and practices. And so that's where you're describing making it easier for customers to make the right choice and how they interact with them. Um, but you have to engage effectively with your suppliers. If it's just, I want on time, I want low cost, and that's the extent of your conversation with them, then you're going to miss out on the innovations that they are already working on or that they could implement. So you really need to work on those strategically because there's long-term development that's required. You have to plan way ahead. That includes because when manufacturers want to change something pretty dramatically, they have to retrofit processes. They might have to do product reformulation or redesign. They would have to innovate on packaging and how they're going to position that within the market. So super important to do that across the whole value chain. And really, this sort of approach needs to become part of the DNA of sustainability efforts in order to make it successful at scale.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Continuing, from our observations from the event, another thing that we noticed from all the talks that we attended was that companies are still prioritizing sustainability despite the political uncertainty. And this was also again solidified by the research that was conducted by BSI about the trends for green commitments and actions. So did that BSI finding match with what you were sensing in the room? And is that how do you think the industry is feeling in general?
Yeah, it's so interesting. British Standards Institute, BSI, is one of the standard setting bodies globally, and they help to really reinforce the use of those standards. So they shared statistics from a recent study from over 7,000 companies across all of the G7 nations. And the trends were really interesting. I think overall, they still see a deep commitment to setting targets and finding ways to achieve them. So that's good. Overall, and pretty consistent across the board, and something that we see as well from senior leaders. But there's real concern under this uncertain political environment on a global basis and within different countries that creates a lot of inconsistency and confusion in terms of what to do and where things are headed. So they're really struggling with how to do that, how to navigate those waters, but also that the level of activity, this is important, is that through 2030, which is right around the corner from a planning perspective, even 2050 is not that far away when you're making major investments. We're working with a client right now that is looking at a new manufacturing facility. They're making a decision that's going to be a 20, 30-year decision. Well, in 23 years, 24 years from now, we'll be in 2050 already. And that's when a lot of
Mm,
companies have
mm.
a net zero target, right? So they're making
Yeah.
decisions today that are going to influence whether they can achieve those targets. So we see that that is being a real a challenge that they're trying to face too, is like what level of activity and decision making is it going to take to move that needle? I think one other thing that they shared that's really interesting is the gap between the intentions of the company to set those targets and achieve them, and then how to communicate that publicly. Like how much of that do they want to share and not? So they were describing how companies are trying to be cautious in positioning for their green initiatives, given that uncertain regulatory and consumer environment. They called it climate coding,
Mm.
but sometimes in what we might call it is something along the line of green hushing or positioning in a way that you're doing it, but you're talking about it maybe in a slightly different way. In fact, we had an in-person seminar on this topic in Bath a few days after the RSCC to really dive into that topic.
Yeah, yeah. That was an interesting conversation too, not gonna lie. But one thing that stood out from the answer that you said was that how companies have set targets, but like you said, 2030 is not that far away, and if you're making a long-term investment, 2050 is not that far away. And usually when you set these targets, the target year seems so far away that sometimes you forget about it, or you don't understand the gravity of it. But now that it's here, now you're suddenly thinking about, oh, how do I meet those targets? And I don't know, maybe it's also a little bit rushing into things. But yeah, it's something for companies to definitely think about. Uh, but do you see that with the targets set, and like I said, it's like we said, it's just right around the corner. How do we see this in the best practices adopted by the companies that were there in the RSCC?
Yeah, I would say that something that's really interesting is for B&Q, for instance, we mentioned, home retailer, that they have to change how they position their products to the market. So when they go to consumers and say that we want to help you as part of the built environment change the way that that is upgraded and created, then there's a different methodology they have to take. So whether it's rental tools instead of purchasing tools, whether it's the material choices that they're making, that consumers can make to buy a new home or improve it. I think that's really interesting, and that's a change in behavior that you're carrying all the way through. Because on the front end, the suppliers have to be ready with those new products, and on the
Yeah.
downstream side on consumers. And then Leprino Foods was really interesting, is they are adding sustainability into their performance targets. So it relates to pay, relates to compensation and bonuses. And so really making it part of everyone's job. And I found that when you do that, there are other companies that take that approach, that really people wake up and say, well, wait a minute, I don't really understand what that is, but now it's part of how I'm going to get paid. And so I want to understand that. Let me
Hmm.
figure out how that matters and how it can contribute to success. So that's another interesting way that can be applied, I think, across the board.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is like a very interesting approach, adding sustainability as part of your job description or having like pay related links to it, because like you said, now even if it was not something that's related to them, now it's handed in, like it's just part of their job description as well. So they have to care about it, and they can't treat it as an external issue, but it's something that the whole company has to care about, and that just drives change eventually. But we obviously heard the pros of it, but when it is implemented, what kind of pushback or internally would you expect? And like, does the pros outweighs the cons, and how does it look like?
I think there's always going to be some pushback because processes that have been established and made a company successful today were built on 5, 10, 20, maybe 50 or 100 years worth of
Mm,
experience, right? To really optimize where they are today. So that change, talk about change management sometimes here, that is something that you have to understand that's going to need to happen within an organization because you can't change immediately. And there are lots of people that have been invested and money invested into the time to set up the processes the way they are today. And now you're saying, well, it's not just an incremental shift we need anymore, a 5% more or 5% less. It has to be something very different. So there can be a lot of pushback on that. It's largely around quality and production and cost. It's not necessarily because people don't agree that it's a good thing to do. I think on average, employees, especially newer ones, want to see a company take actions like this, but they just don't know how. And so that's why leveraging best practices and information that companies have access to, for instance, like with the ISTEP network, where we publish these best practices and ideas and findings and case studies, of course, all free of charge for anyone that's interested in checking that out, then that helps them figure out how to do that, give them some tips and
yeah.
practices.
Circling back, Ben, I think before we conclude, one thing that we heard throughout our conversations with attendees of the conference, how they kept reiterating that, people are the backbone of supply chain, so it's important to focus on them as well. And I know that, Fosterra was also founded on that people first idea, and thinking through the lens of suppliers, uh, and, also making sure their experience and like thinking through their welfare, things like that. So I would like to ask you, how did that come up, and why did you think that was important when you founded Fosterra?
Yeah, 12 years ago, this was all a new concept. This is way before supply chain is where it is now in terms of visibility, is even before SBTI and before some of the goals across the board that we see is more common. It was really how do we engage with the supply chain? How do we help them set targets that make them move forward, help them move forward on their own sustainability initiatives? And then how do we get also the ability to really understand what's happening to prioritize efforts. So we want to be able to get data, make it easy for them to participate, make it engaging, provide them with the resources that they need to be successful. And as people, right, we're all just people doing these jobs and making really important decisions. So helping work through that. But if we make it easy, if we make it more engaging, if we make it more applicable to their own situation, not just generic, then that's something that can really be successful. So that's always been important for us. And as the industry continues to evolve, we are, evolving with it to try to stay ahead of where those big challenges are.
Yeah, yeah. And I think our client suppliers also appreciate it, because in the conversations that I've sat through, I've heard them saying that the way we have designed the surveys is the best that they have seen. And so it really shows, how much putting them first and thinking through their lens, they appreciate it, and it's also making them want to participate more. So yeah, that leads into my, I think, last question. How do you see all of this act as a catalyst for change management?
Yeah, I think it's all about, as we mentioned, this is a change in behavior, and it's not just an incremental change. It's have to be something significant. So if we treat everyone as an individual that has their own challenges and motivations, and we look at every company and product as having its own evolutionary path towards a more sustainable future, then that's going to be key. If we treat everybody as just a number and as a sort of a generic pool of purchases, then it's not going to be that effective. Now, having said that, you need solid data. You need to have the information that's necessary to know if you're making progress and to set targets. But then moving beyond that is also super important.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. This was a very interesting discussion, Ben, to explore the conversations and observations we had from the event. We got the chance to interact with sustainability leaders across industries, and they have definitely inspired us on how we can ensure responsible supply chains. For our listeners, I'd say if you found any part of this conversation interesting, I'd urge you to check out the ISTEP resource page. We have resources about the strategies, the solutions, the approach some of these companies in attendance took, and I'm sure it'll be interesting read for you all. We also hosted another event in June, like Ben mentioned earlier. So yeah, also stay tuned for another podcast from our end.
Great. Thank you, Josha, and thank you everyone for listening, and look forward to having more of these in the near future.
Yeah, thank you.